Older, Further, Stranger, Episode 6, Soft Machine. I'm your host, Jacob Oren Gold. 1. Vindolanda and the Anaerobic Ditches. Vindolanda lies about a mile south of Hadrian's Wall, in a shallow bowl of upland Northumberland. The ground there is low-lying, the drainage is poor, and the water table is high. The fort was built in successive timber phases beginning around 85 CE, before the wall itself went up, and it was occupied for more than 3 centuries. Hadrian's Wall runs 73 miles across the narrowest neck of northern Britain, from the Solway Firth on the west coast to Wallsend on the Tyne in the east. It is built of turf and stone, 8 to 10 feet wide at the base, 16 feet high where it still stands. Every Roman mile there is a fortified mile castle with signal towers between them. The Emperor Hadrian ordered the work begun around 122 CE after a personal inspection tour convinced him that the edge of the empire needed a clear line. For the next 3 centuries, the forts along it were manned by auxiliary troops recruited from across the Roman world. Batavians from the Rhine Delta, Tungrians from what is now Belgium, Asturians from northern Spain, Thracians, Dacians, Syrians, men who spoke their own languages and carried their own gods. The wall was not a border in our modern sense. It was a managed checkpoint. You paid your toll, your goods were inspected, and you passed through. Behind it lay a zone Rome considered its own, however tenuously. For most of the history of Roman archaeology in Britain, what came out of the ground along that frontier was what came out of the ground almost everywhere in Roman Britain: stone foundations, ceramic sherds, the occasional bronze brooch, post holes of timber buildings long since rotted, and inscriptions on altars naming deities and dedicating offerings. The picture that formed was military and institutional, a garrison culture, professional and functional. The human texture of daily life was missing because the materials that life was made of, leather, wood, cloth, food, had been consumed by the earth long before any archaeologist arrived. At Vindolanda, the conditions were different. When each timber phase of the garrison was abandoned, the refuse went into the surrounding ditches and was sealed under clay. Clay excludes oxygen. Without oxygen, the bacteria and fungi that normally destroy organic matter could not work. The sealed ditches preserved leather, wood, cloth, and other perishable things that ordinarily disappear. When Robin Burley began systematic excavation in the 1970s, and when his son Andrew Burley continued the work in the decades that followed, what came up out of the ground was leather, the largest assemblage of Roman leather from anywhere in the former empire, now more than 7,300 cataloged items. Roughly 5,000 of them are shoes. Dr. Elizabeth Green of the University of Western Ontario has measured and cataloged the entire collection. The average shoe measures about a men's US size 8 to 9, which tells you the population was somewhat shorter on average than ours, with feet shaped over a lifetime by different footwear and different terrain. The extremes are striking. At the nearby fort of Magna, they have recovered a shoe nearly 13 inches long, a US men's size 15, and 8 more shoes of 12 inches or longer. The men who served on Hadrian's Wall were drawn from every corner of the empire, and their feet showed it. The military caligae, the hobnailed marching boots you see in every Roman sculpture, appear here in several different patterns. The hobnail arrangements vary by function: dense and heavy for marching on stone roads, lighter and more widely spaced for indoor duty, different again for parade. Carol Van Driel Murray's study of the collection shows Roman cobblers working with layered soles and turned uppers, separating the functions of each part of the shoe with genuine skill. The leather is mostly vegetable tanned cattle hide with goat used for finer work. You can read the repair history on almost every shoe: resoling, patching with offcuts, hobnails replaced again and again until the shoe finally wore out. There are standardized offcuts, precise awl holes, production waste mixed with finished repairs, the ordinary working mess of a cobbler's shop stopped in place. The workshop evidence is everywhere in the leather assemblage. Offcuts appear in standardized shapes, showing that cobblers were cutting soles and uppers from prepared sheets of leather according to practice patterns. All holes run in precise sequences, showing the stitching techniques. Repair patches were cut from leather that was itself already repaired, showing an economy of material that reused everything until it could be reused no more. The Romans were not cavalier about leather, tent panels, horse tackle, shield covers, saddle components. Leather was as essential to the Roman military machine as iron, and it was treated accordingly. Vandriel Murray's analysis shows not a random accumulation of waste, but a coherent picture of a supply chain. Hides arriving, being processed, being worked by skilled craftsmen who understood their materials and their tools, with offcuts carefully managed rather than simply discarded. Among the most telling finds are the children's shoes. They are small and carefully made. Several are worn through at the toe exactly where a child's shoe wears through from running. There is even a baby's first pair, soft-soled, the upper worked in a delicate fishnet cutwork pattern. Before Vindolanda, the accepted picture of Roman frontier life was masculine and military. The children's shoes make that picture impossible to maintain. Someone's kids were running around inside the fort, their shoes wore out, and the shoes went into the ditch. You find other things as well. A pair of boxing gloves, the only surviving Roman boxing gloves from anywhere in the empire. Leather, padded, the knuckle area worn from use. A wooden toilet seat, combs, tent panels, the complete organic inventory of a military community's daily life, the sort of thing that is invisible everywhere the soil chemistry is ordinary. In 1992, in the same ditch system as the shoes, they recovered a carved wooden object about 17 centimeters long. It was cataloged at the time as a darning mushroom and put away in storage. In 2023, the archaeologist Rob Collins, whose work includes the study of sexuality on the Roman frontier, examined it again with careful use-wear analysis. The shape and the polish left by handling make it almost certain that it served a different purpose altogether. Collins and his colleague Rob Sands of University College Dublin published their analysis in Antiquity under the title Touchwood: Luck, Protection, Power, or Pleasure, a wooden phallus from Vindolanda Roman fort. Three possibilities were weighed with equal care. It could be a herm, a phallic object placed near an entrance as an apotropaic charm against the evil eye. Phallic imagery appeared in shop signs, children's amulets, architectural cornices, and iron knife handles throughout the Roman world, so a wooden example hung by a door would have been unremarkable. It could be a pestle for grinding medicinal or cosmetic preparations, the shape giving good grip for the palm and the wear on the rounded base consistent with that use. Or it could be a personal sexual implement, possibly the oldest surviving wooden example from anywhere in the ancient world. The wear patterns rule out the pestle as the least likely. Collins and Sands declined to choose between the devotional and the erotic possibilities. What is certain is that the object only exists because the ditch was anaerobic. In ordinary soil, ash wood survives perhaps 50 years. This one survived 19 centuries. None of this was supposed to survive. The normal archaeological record of Roman Britain is stone and broken ceramic and the occasional bronze brooch. That is what the ground usually returns, the inorganic skeleton. The leather world, the world people actually lived in, touched, wore, repaired, and discarded, was supposed to be gone. Then the tablets appeared. There are about 1,800 of them now, thin slivers of birch and alder the size of a postcard, written in a rapid cursive Latin that took epigraphers years to read. They are the largest collection of Latin writing on wood from the entire Roman world, and they are not official documents. They are ordinary life. Alan Bowman of Oxford and David Thomas have been editing them since the 1980s in the Tabulae Vindolandenses series. Tabula Vindolanda 291 is Claudia Severa's birthday invitation to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, wife of the fort commander Flavius Carialis, written sometime around 100 CE. The formal body of the letter was composed by a scribe. Claudia Severa, as an officer's wife, would have had access to literate slaves or freedmen for correspondence, and runs, Claudia Severa to her Lepidina, greetings. On the third day before the Ides of September, sister, for the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us, to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival, if you are present. Give my greetings to your Carialis. My alias and my little son send him their greetings. Then the scribe's hand stops. A second, noticeably different hand takes over, less practiced, more urgent. The letters formed slightly differently for the closing lines. I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail. Claudia Severa picked up the pen herself, her own handwriting, the oldest surviving Latin handwriting by a woman in the Western Roman Empire, says simply that she will wait and calls her friend Animula, little soul. Tab, Vindal, 346 records a soldier acknowledging receipt of socks sent by someone called Satua, 2 pairs of sandals, 2 pairs of underpants, and asking for more. Until Vindolanda, no one knew Roman soldiers in Britain wore socks. Tab Vindal 302 is an order for bruised beans, 2 modi, 20 chickens, 100 apples if you can find nice ones, 100 or 200 eggs at a fair price, 8 sextarii of fish sauce, a modius of olives. The garum was imported. The olives certainly were. Someone on Hadrian's Wall in the late 1st century CE was hoping the apples were nice and trying to get a fair price on eggs. Tab Vindal 118 is a child's writing exercise, a line copied from the Aeneid, Book 9, verse 473, one letter missed, and in the margin, a second hand, segniter, sloppily. They were teaching Virgil on the wall and marking homework with the compressed authority of teachers everywhere. Tab Vindal 164 contains the word Britunculi, wretched little Britons, in a military report assessing the local cavalry. It is the oldest recorded ethnic slur in British history, written with casual contempt by someone who was himself almost certainly Belgian. A strength report from around 90 CE records that of the 752 soldiers nominally garrisoned with the first cohort of Tungrians, only 265 were fit for active duty. The rest were sick, detached, or assigned elsewhere. The Roman military machine, in other words, was chronically understaffed relative to its official complement. This was completely unknown before Vindolanda. Vindolanda did not show us a different Roman Britain. It showed us that we had been trying to understand Roman Britain with almost none of the evidence. The fort was not simply a garrison. It was a world. Literate, commercial, domestic, sometimes funny, sometimes tender, and the only reason we can see any of it is because the ground kept the leather and the wood and the tablets from rotting away. 2. What taphonomy tells us about what usually disappears. Having seen what the ground preserved at Vindolanda when the chemistry worked in its favor, we can now turn to the larger question of why so little usually survives at all. The technical term for what happens to things after they enter the ground is taphonomy, from the Greek word for burial. Its central finding is simple and sobering. Almost everything rots. Wood disappears within decades in ordinary soil. Leather lasts a few centuries at best. Cloth, food, skin, papyrus, paint, everything organic is consumed by water, oxygen, and bacteria on timescales that are nothing against the depth of history. What the ground returns without extraordinary conditions is the inorganic skeleton, stone, fired ceramic, metal, the temple, not the house, the sword, not the shirt, the epitaph, not the letter. The archaeological record is therefore not a sample of the past. It is a filtered remnant, and the filter has a consistent bias. It removes the center of daily life, the texture of it, the warmth of it, the materials through which most people moved through the world, and leaves the residue of permanence and power. We have reconstructed ancient civilizations from that durable fraction and called it history. And it is history, but it is the history of what happens not to decompose. The exceptions are what matter. Moments when specific chemistry lets the organic world survive along with the skeleton. Each such moment is a window into the vanished everyday, and each one implies, by the scale of what it gives back, the scale of what was lost everywhere, the conditions were ordinary. With that in mind, we can now look at what happened when an entire city was sealed by volcanic heat and ash. 3. Pompeii, a city buried at mid-morning. On the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, the 17-year-old Pliny the Younger was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Western Fleet, at Misenum on the northern cape of the Bay of Naples. His mother pointed out a cloud of unusual size and shape rising from Vesuvius. The elder Pliny took warships across the bay toward the eruption, partly to observe the phenomenon, partly to rescue people trapped on the shore. He reached Stabiae, sheltered for a night, tried to leave the next morning when the ash and sulfur made breathing agonizing, collapsed on the beach, and died there. By the following morning, Pompeii was under 4 to 6 meters of volcanic deposit. The city had about 11,000 to 12,000 residents. Most had fled when the pumice began falling the previous afternoon, though a significant number stayed, too old, too attached to their possessions, too uncertain about which direction was safe, or simply too late. What the eruption sealed when it sealed the city was not ruins, but a working morning. The bakeries had bread in their ovens, the wine bars had amphorae on their shelves, the gardens had their furniture in place, and the residents who hadn't escaped were, in the most literal sense, caught in the middle of ordinary life. The pyroclastic surges that followed carbonized organics without destroying their shape. Thermopolia counters still held the remains of duck, pig, goat, tuna, land snails, chickpeas, and fava wine mixes. The 2020 excavation of a complete thermopolium in Regio 5, the first ever cleared in its entirety, found those remains in the sunken jars and a painted menu board above the counter showing exactly what was available. Most Pompeian households below the elite level had no kitchen. The city ate out daily as a matter of urban infrastructure. 80 thermopolia have been identified in a city of 11 to 12,000 people. This tells us that street dining was not a luxury or an occasional treat, but ordinary infrastructure for people who lived in small rooms without cooking facilities. The fast food counters were as central to daily life as the forum or the baths. In one house, a wooden chest contained a sorceress's practical magic kit: crystals, amber and amethyst, bone buttons, Middle Eastern scarab beetles, phallic amulets, miniature figures, a tiny skull, bells, carnelian craftsman engraving, bird bones for evil eye rituals. It is the toolkit of someone who dealt in protection, fertility, and seduction for clients who could not afford gold. These objects were not grand temple dedications. They were small, portable, and personal, carried or kept in a chest for use when needed. Their survival shows that ordinary people maintained private ritual practices alongside public religion, and that those practices involved tangible objects meant to affect real outcomes in health, love, and safety. In 2024, DNA taken from plaster casts of the victims overturned a century of assumptions. 14 casts were sampled. In the House of the Golden Bracelet, 4 individuals were not genetically related as a family. An adult wearing a golden bracelet and holding a child was genetically male and unrelated to the child. The embracing sisters included at least one genetic male. All sampled Pompeians show Eastern Mediterranean immigrant ancestry. The city was cosmopolitan. The plaster casts had told stories about kinship and status that the bones themselves did not support. This matters because it shows how easily we project our own ideas of family and belonging onto the past when the organic evidence is missing. The DNA returns the actual movement of people and the mixed households that the stone record could not reveal. Giuseppe Fiorelli, who took over the excavation in 1860, devised the technique of filling the cavities left by decomposed bodies in the hardened ash with liquid plaster. A man with his arm thrown over his face, a woman holding a child, a dog still chained, caught in its last agony. These are not representations. They are the specific geometry of specific deaths. Survivors and transients returned for centuries after the eruption. 5th century Christian lamps and family bread ovens in cellars show a precarious gray agglomeration among the ruins. The city did not end cleanly. People kept living among the ruins in whatever way they could. 4. Herculaneum and the carbonized scrolls. At Herculaneum, the same surges carbonized the scrolls in the Villa of the Papyri, probably the country estate of Julius Caesar's father-in-law, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus. The pyroclastic surge moved at several hundred degrees Celsius, hot enough to carbonize the scrolls, but not by an accident of temperature and burial chemistry to destroy the geometric structure of the papyrus surface entirely. The scrolls became black, brittle cylinders physically indistinguishable from charcoal. They stayed that way for 18 centuries. Physical unrolling destroyed most of what was tried. In 2023, Brent Seals of the University of Kentucky helped launch the Vesuvius Challenge, an open competition to read the scrolls using high-resolution X-ray tomography and machine learning. The carbon ink has a subtly different density signature from the carbon papyrus, detectable in CT scan data if you have the right algorithm. In October 2023, Luke Ferreter, a 21-year-old computer science student, trained a neural network on the scan data and recovered the first legible word from an unopened scroll: porphyros, purple, a Greek word unread for 2,000 years. By February 2024, enough continuous text had been recovered to identify the content, an Epicurean treatise by Philodemus of Gadara arguing that the deepest pleasures are not sensory but relational, found in the company of friends in familiar places in the comfort of the known. By May 2025, the title and author of a second sealed scroll had been read, Philodemus again, on Vices. The main library of the Villa of the Papyri is still underground. We have been reading Western philosophy for 2 millennia from a canon shaped by what medieval monks chose to copy and what fires and floods chose to spare. That canon is about to change. Philosophy that had been lost for centuries is now emerging letter by letter from sealed carbon, showing us thoughts about pleasure, friendship, and the good life that the surviving tradition had filtered out. 6. The natural mummies. The mummies are a different category of miracle, not the preservation of what people made and wrote, but of the people themselves and the clothes they wore, the things they carried, and the marks they left on their own bodies. We will take them one region at a time, beginning with the desert burials of Western China and moving to the frozen tombs of the Altai and the rock shelter burials of the Green Sahara. For each, we will look at the clothes, what was carried, substances like ephedra and related medicaments, what strontium analysis and DNA show about where people came from and how they lived, and what all of this indicates about the texture of daily and ritual life. In the high, dry air of the Taklamakan Desert in western China around 4,000 years ago, people buried their dead in boat-shaped coffins made of wood. The desert salt and the extreme dryness preserved the bodies, the clothing, the ephedra pouches, the woolen cloaks, the felt hats. One young woman, known now as the Beauty of Xiaohe, still lies with her white felt hat, her string skirt, her long eyelashes intact. Another, the Princess of Xiaohe, holds an ephedra pouch in her hands. Their DNA, analyzed by Zhang and colleagues and published in Nature in 2021, tells a story that does not fit any simple map. They belong to an isolated ancient North Eurasian lineage, a ghost population that mostly vanished. Stable isotope analysis of their remains shows local adaptation to the desert environment rather than recent migration from distant regions. Strontium ratios in teeth and bone indicate they grew up and lived in the same area where they were buried. They were not outsiders passing through. They were people who had made this extreme place their home for generations. What they were carrying tells you something about daily and ritual life in that world. Ephedra is a shrub common in arid regions. Its stems contain compounds that act as stimulants and can ease breathing. Pouches or twigs of it appear with several individuals, often fastened to the corner of felt mantles or placed beside the body. In ancient China, it had been used for medicine for thousands of years as a central nervous excitant. It also appears in ceremonies to produce feelings of exhilaration and was part of ritual drinks like haoma or soma in Iran and India for longevity and immortality. In the Tarim graves, it was collected from neighboring arid terrains and placed with the dead alongside wheat and millet. This indicates that people used local plants for both practical health needs, energy and breathing in a harsh desert, and for ritual or religious purposes, perhaps preparing the dead for a journey or invoking protection and vitality in the afterlife. The fact that it was carried in small pouches close to the body shows it was part of personal, everyday equipment as well as grave goods. The clothes were made of wool twills with tartan-like structures, leather, felt hats, and string skirts. Felt is produced by matting and pressing wool or animal hair without weaving. It is warm, water-resistant, and relatively simple to produce from local animals. Wool was the domestic material, woven into twills and used for cloaks, mantles, and leggings. String skirts were made from local plant fibers or wool. Some garments show multi-layered construction and recombination of techniques from different traditions. Silk appears in later related finds, imported and used for luxury or status. These were not crude wrappings. They were garments that had been made, worn, and chosen for the dead, layered for warmth and protection, sometimes with tassels or decorative elements. The boat coffins and explicit wooden phallic and vulval posts suggest preparation for a journey after death or symbols of fertility and life force. One male shows evidence of abdominal surgery with horsehair stitches that had healed before death. The community practiced sophisticated medicine and took care with the dead, including children who received full adult ritual treatment. What this indicates for the lived texture is a pastoral or trading community with skilled textile technology, long distance connections visible in materials and techniques, and a worldview in which clothing, carried plants, and ritual objects prepared people for both daily survival and whatever came after death. The organic preservation returns the intimate scale of how these people dressed, moved, and marked their world, something the stone record of tools and bones alone could never show. Further north, in the permafrost of the Altai Mountains on the border of Kazakhstan and Russia, the Ice Maiden was found in 1993 by Natalia Polosmak at Akalaka 3 on the Ukok Plateau. She was about 25 to 30 years old, buried around 2,500 years ago in a frozen kurgan. She wore a tall felt headdress decorated with gold leaf felines and swans, a yellow silk blouse from India, wool skirt, and leggings. Her body was covered in elaborate tattoos, deer, griffins, leopards, done by a professional hand. Near-infrared imaging in the 2020s revealed differences in tool pressure and line weight that show a master at work, with an apprentice perhaps learning beside her. The tattoos were not casual decoration. They formed a cosmological map on her skin. Felt for the headdress was produced locally from animal hair matted and pressed. The silk blouse had traveled from India, showing participation in long-distance exchange networks. Wool and leather completed the outfit. She had advanced breast cancer and a deformed spine. She had been carried everywhere because she could not ride. After death, her brain was removed through trepanation, the skull stuffed with herbs and horsehair, and sewn shut. 6 horses were sacrificed with her, some wearing antler masks. A cannabis brazier and inhalation tent were placed in the tomb, along with coriander seeds. The permafrost kept every detail: the tattoos, the silk, the pain she lived with, the cosmological map she wore on her skin. Scholars now see her as a shaman whose suffering and altered body gave her access to the spirit world. Strontium and other isotopic work on comparable Altai burials shows individuals with mixed local and longer distance connections, consistent with the nomadic pastoral world of the Scythian period. Cannabis was used in braziers for inhalation, producing effects that could support ritual or visionary experience. In broader ancient contexts, medicaments like opium appear in late Bronze Age graves in the Eastern Mediterranean. Earliest physical evidence from Tel Yehud in Israel around the 14th century BCE, where opium alkaloids were found in ceramic vessels in Canaanite graves, apparently used as offerings for the dead. Similar residues appear in Cypriot base ring juglets shaped like poppy capsules, suggesting advertised trade in the substance. In Egypt, Traces in alabaster vessels point to possible use in funerary or medicinal contexts over centuries. These substances indicate early management of pain, altered states, and ritual preparation for death or the afterlife, often tied to international exchange. What this indicates is a world in which physical suffering, body modification, carried plants for altered states, and elaborate adornment were intertwined with status and cosmology. The clothes she wore in life, the local felt and imported silk, marked her place in networks of trade and craft. The tattoos turned her body into a living map. The plants and medicaments show practical and ritual technologies for navigating pain and the unseen. The organic preservation returns the texture of how people lived with chronic conditions, marked their bodies, and prepared for death in ways that feel both intimate and profoundly other. 7. Takarkori, relic of the Green Sahara. In the Sahara, at Takarkori Rock Shelter in southwestern Libya, two women from about 7,000 years ago were naturally mummified by the arid conditions. They lived during the Green Sahara when the desert was savanna and lakes. Their genomes, published by Salem and colleagues in Nature in 2025, reveal a previously unknown North African lineage that had diverged from other populations around the time of the out of Africa migration. Strontium isotope analysis of their remains and those of others in the shelter confirms local origins. They were not migrants from far away, but people rooted in the Fezzan region across generations. They were pastoralists, herders of cattle, then sheep and goats, makers of pottery and basketry. The shelter was both home and cemetery, used for 5,000 years, with burials focused on women and children. The desert preserved their soft tissue long enough for modern ADNA to bring back a ghost branch of humanity that had been almost entirely erased. What they were carrying and using: pottery for processing plants and dairy, basketry for storage and transport, grinding stones, reflects a sophisticated adaptation to a changing landscape of lakes, grasslands, and seasonal movement. Basketry was twined from local fibers, pottery was fired and used for cooking and storage. These were not simple tools. They show accumulated knowledge of materials and techniques passed across generations. The lived texture here is one of women and children at the center of burial practice, of herding economies that shifted with the drying climate, and of material culture that shows skill in fiber work and ceramic production across millennia. This matters because it returns a picture of African pastoral life before the full desertification of the Sahara, a world of lakes and grass, of women-centered ritual attention, and of technical skill in making containers and processing food that the later stone record of the region would largely erase. 8. Dunhuang, portable ritual engines and the mixing of traditions. Having examined what the chemistry of permafrost, desert salt, and volcanic ash could preserve in bodies, clothes, and carried substances, we can now turn to sites where dry air and deliberate human action kept written and ritual objects intact for centuries. In the sealed library cave at Dunhuang on the edge of the Gobi, some 50,000 manuscripts, paintings, and ritual objects were piled into a side chamber off Cave 16 and walled up around the year 1000. The dry air kept them intact. Aurel Stein in 1907 described a 10-foot-high mass filling 500 cubic feet. Forensic codicology from the International Dunhuang Project shows active use right up to sealing. Some bundles were layered later. Among the objects is an octagonal Vajrasattva wheel stake, roughly 15 to 20 centimeters long, with paper facets bearing mineral pigments, cinnabar and orpiment, and grip polish on the wooden shaft from repeated insertion into effigies or the earth. X-ray fluorescence shows trace iron that may be donor blood. It is a portable tool for Mahayoga visualization and liberation rites, active use, then deposited in a sacred waste hoard. The stake was carried and used in ritual, then placed with other objects when its work was done or when the community decided to seal the chamber. Each facet carried a different motif, including a figure of Vajrasattva and a wheel, showing cross-fertilization of visual traditions from China, Tibet, and Central Asia. These were small, powerful objects meant to be held or inserted during practice, ritual engines for tantric visualization that people carried with them. Fingernail-sized embroidered silk seed syllable charms survive, Indian silk stitched by hand alongside local hemp. These tiny objects were personal, stitched with care, and carried for protection or power. Paleo-Tibetan 42 and its joins contain a massive Mahayoga compendium. One section on Essegrolba describes effigy dismemberment and torma offerings in language so violent it has been called the most violent text from the library cave, copied in the same scriptorium alongside Vinaya discipline texts with marginal notes suggesting experimental practice. Urk Batig, the only complete Old Turkic runic divination manual, preserves 65 omens in red ink dice pips: dog howls at night, house burns, hair crosses right to left, misfortune, cuckoo calls, wish granted. It keeps a pre-Buddhist animist tradition alongside Nestorian Sogdian prayers painted as a saint with crosses, Manichaean bifolios with dualistic hymns and diagrams, medical texts with lost recipes, and hemorrhagical calendars with star charts that are the earliest complete examples surviving. This collection shows a frontier monastic world where tantric visualization, step divination, portable sanctity, and Silk Road syncretism were engineered at sleeve scale. The objects were made to be carried and used, stakes inserted repeatedly, charms stitched small enough to wear or hold, texts copied for practice. Their deposition in a sealed chamber was not casual disposal, but a deliberate act that preserved the living mess of belief and experiment. What this indicates for the lived texture is that people in this place maintained complex ritual technologies in portable form, experimented with violent and transgressive imagery alongside disciplined practice, and treated writing and objects as things that could be both used and set aside when their time came. The dry air and the human decision to wall up the chamber returned a laboratory of belief that canons later simplified, religion as something people carried, tested, and mixed on the edges of empires. 9. Cairo, Geniza, sacred trove and lives lived across oceans. In the attic of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo, 400,000 fragments accumulated over centuries because Jewish law forbade destroying any paper with the name of God. The arid attic preserved them through what has been called holy hygiene. Karaite commentaries sit among rabbinite texts. One anonymous Hosea commentary pieced from 131 tiny fragments shows literal exegesis, with philosophical and astronomical layers absent from standard rabbinite midrash. Marriage deeds blend Karaite and rabbinite clauses. Abraham Maimonides, writing in his own hand, answered a query about a merchant absent 15 years in India, presumed dead, levirate obligations, inheritance, the wife left behind. Court records from 1226 deal with Jewish traders in Southeast Asia and polygamy rulings for men with households in multiple ports. Yemenite queries concern calendar adjustments and fasting under persecution. Batch-produced Hebrew scorpion amulets, cut from single sheets with crude drawings and iron gall ink, were made for Fustat's real scorpion problem and rolled into cases for neck or wrist. Variants show needle-pierced scorpions or extra names. Abraham Ben Yiju, a Tunisian calligrapher, merchant, and poet, spent roughly 17 years in Mangalore on the Malabar coast. His letters detail his wife Ashu, a freed slave, their children, Indian servants, and the daily work of keeping a Mediterranean household kosher amid local spices, pharmaceuticals traded with pepper and textiles, and monsoon realities. Undelivered pleas from Agonaut, abandoned wives, record eviction, beatings, and a poor-sighted widow begging for her daughter. Syncretic medical notebooks mix Galenic theory with Indian Ocean imports.
sandalwood, cardamom, betel nut, myrobalan, and cuba from merchant hands that also note Buddhist customs in India, bleeding into hygiene and herbal pragmatism.
These fragments show a Mediterranean and Indian Ocean Jewish world in which law was negotiated in real time for monsoon isolation, tropical bodies, and distant households. Scorpion amulets were mass produced because scorpions were a real danger. Merchants carried both halakhic questions and materia medica across oceans. The attic preserved the ordinary mess of lives that moved between ports, between legal traditions, and between practical medicine and sacred obligation. What this indicates is that people maintained connections across vast distances, adapted ancient law to new climates and separations, and treated writing as something too holy to destroy, even when it recorded the most ordinary human troubles: wives left behind, children to be cared for, scorpions to be warded off. The arid attic returned voices that the filter of official history would have eaten. 10. Viking ship burial and the performance of death. In 922 CE, the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan witnessed a ship burial among the Rus on the Volga. The account is detailed and unflinching. 10 days of drinking, a slave girl used sexually by the men of the company, then sacrificed with a knife between the ribs and strangled. The ship burned with the chief, goods, animals, and horses. Archaeology at Oseberg and Gokstad shows ship burials with sacrificed animals and goods. Neil Price reads Fadlan's account as a script for a theatrical performance of death. Specific burial clothes made only for the event, animals, and humans as set pieces in a cosmological drama. The boundary between life, death, and spectacle was porous. This matters because it shows a ritual world in which death was staged with precise choreography, where status and cosmology were performed publicly, and where the line between the living and the dead was crossed in ways that feel alien to modern sensibilities, yet were ordinary enough to be witnessed and recorded by an outsider. What new technology is finding in anoxic depths? Look to the future and the accidents continue. In the Black Sea, below about 150 meters, the water is permanently anoxic. Shipwrecks there preserve wood, textiles, cargo, even food remains, entire time capsules from Byzantine and medieval periods. In Lake Neuchatel in Switzerland, drone surveys in 2024 and 2025 located an intact Roman cargo vessel with stacked ceramics still in their original positions, amphorae, chariot parts, sailors' effects. Affordable underwater drones and remotely operated vehicles are opening anoxic depths that traditional diving could never reach. The accidents keep happening, and new technology keeps finding them. What this means is that the same preservative chemistry that once worked by chance in ditches, deserts, and permafrost is now being deliberately sought with new tools, returning closed contexts, stacked plates still in transport position, entire ship types never seen before that the surface record could never provide. These are not curiosities. They are the past looking back at us with its own eyes, older, further, and far more alive than the stone record ever suggested. A mother inviting her friend to a birthday party in her own handwriting. A cobbler patching a shoe through 3 or 4 rounds of repair because the difference between maintained footwear and none was the difference between a functional soldier and a casualty. A shaman carrying chronic pain on a body marked with cosmological animals by a master's hand, wearing silk that had traveled from India and felt made from local animals, using plants like ephedra and cannabis for energy, vision, or ritual. Women in the Green Sahara buried with the basketry and pottery of their daily life, their lineage later revealed by DNA to be one that stood apart for millennia. A merchant writing across monsoons about a wife left behind for 15 years while trading Indian drugs and carrying both halakhic questions and practical remedies. A child scolded for sloppy Virgil, a soldier asking for more socks. The leather, the tablets, the mummies with their felt hats and silk blouses and ephedra pouches and healed surgical scars, the scrolls, the carbonized philosophy, the preserved last meals, the batch amulets, the violent visualization texts, the divination omens. They are not supplements to the skeleton record. They are the living tissue. The past is mostly lost, but every so often it is not. And when it is not, you never look at the ground beneath your feet the same way again.